Okay, first off, I really like the Vegan Vanguard's podcast and watch a fair few of Mexi and Marine's YouTube videos. So this is more of a contribution to a discussion than a typical YouTube response video, where they it's kind of as pointless as World War One, where they draw up battle lines, dig trenches, and then take pot shots at each other, and it just goes on and on. So this is, I think, more of a measured response than that. I made this video because I think that anti-natalism is a pretty reactionary movement, and there was a little bit more that I had to add from what I heard of the Vegan Vanguard podcast on it. Anti-natalism funnels resentment away from the system and onto individuals. So it's basically a classic liberal politics or a ploy. Also, I see the idea of anti-natalism as being literally anti-human, which in my mind places it in the same anti-human category as Judeo-Christianity. So you might be religious, but if you don't know exactly how Judeo-Christianity is anti-human, I'd suggest starting with Friedrich Nietzsche, famous German philosopher. So, for example, in his Genealogy of Morals, Friedrich Nietzsche plumbs the depths of our Western constructions of morality. So he traces morality back to, the world of antiquity, like ancient Greece and Rome, and and so that's basically like the conqueror comes along and masters a group of people, takes their land, makes laws, like the pagan world that you see in antiquity. So Nietzsche's first criticisms of morality comes from how it got dominated by Judeo-Christianity. So with Christianity first arriving on the scene, he sees a slave ethic clearly elevated to a kind of divine status. So what I mean by that is that, you can see it in the Bible, that the humble and the meek shall inherit God's kingdom in the afterlife, as a kind of ultimate revenge against the master and their, in those times, open display of power. So we just have to cast our minds back to, Roman sort of domination of their empire, that whenever the Germans or the Ostrogoths or whoever would rise up and defend their homeland and revolt, a Caesar would pretty much just march into there with an army and crush them. And there would be no real reason for war needed. So in those times of the pagan era, the master valued strength, beauty, riches, and fame. You can see all this when you read ancient epics like those of Homer and Aeschylus and all of that kind of stuff. And the slave morality sort of reverses all of this situation and makes a virtue out of weakness, ugliness, poverty, and obscurity. So if you have all these things, then it's easier to get into heaven. Kind of like the old phrase, it's easier for, I'm probably misquoting this, a poor man to get into heaven, than it is for a rich man who has to travel through the eye of a needle or something like that. Probably completely botched that, but yeah. Anyway, so part of the power of Nietzsche's argument is that we all live under the weight of a history of slave morality, at least in the West, a morality of repressed violent desires to conquer our masters. And because we can't really practically do this, it's pretty suicidal because the masters own everything, including armies and so on. So we dress up this violent desire as a humble virtue. So even in secular society, which we live in now, sort of post-religious autocracies, in the West at least, we are the wolf in sheep's clothing. So this repressed, largely unconscious violence in our morality is anti-human, precisely because we as slaves and the offspring of slaves can't challenge the master openly, and so we can't fully express our own will and independent agency. We therefore are compelled to self-flagellate, so like whip ourselves, to punish ourselves with slavishness, denial, and self-directed violence. We are committed to perform anti-human rituals, like deference to those with a higher status than us, and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, etc., and then call it all good. I myself do not have children, getting back to anti-natalism, nor do I have any plans to have them soon, but it might still happen. But that's my personal choice. As Marin and Mexi argue, politicizing this choice leads to a lot of problems. So go listen to their podcast for a really good and nuanced discussion about that one. I have two major points to add to their analysis. One, that anti-natalism is anti-human and anti-intellectual. And two, that it would be an abject failure tactically in achieving animal liberation, which is their goal, a struggle which would involve multiple generations, because anti-natalism is self-defeating bourgeois nihilism. Okay, so first off, anti-natalism being anti-human. I think this should be self-evident. You literally don't want humans to procreate. Okay, I get it. I look around and I think, even in Australia, there are too many people driving a long way to work each day, eating another snagger on the barbie, voting Liberal or Labour, willfully ignorant that these capitalist parties oppress us domestically and spread imperialist war abroad. But I digress. But most people have kids not by choice, but due to some really big pervasive political and cultural norms. So to blame individuals for the inherent problems of capitalism, namely the drive to reproduce more consumers, workers, to increase profits, is reactionary and shifts the criticism from governments, corporations, and mass media to regular human beings who are actually being oppressed by phenomena such as the gendered wedding industry. So this is a commercial apparatus so vast and bloated, it has been referred to as the wedding industrial complex in parts of academia. And government policies such as those under John Howard and Kevin Rudd, the kind that gave financial incentives for Australian mothers to give birth to the next generation of consumer/workers. But in all this, there's something deeper going on. The antenatal movement's diatribe about how waiting in queues and being too hot or too cold or uncomfortable, this is what makes life fundamentally not worth living, is understandable and relatable on a surface level. Yet underneath these so-called first world problems, of the sort that comedians like Jerry Seinfeld and David Mitchell have peddled to hilarious effect, yet their jokes have become less funny and more repetitive the longer that their careers have gone on. We encounter a sort of Western-style religious fundamentalism, which parallels that of the Islamic fundamentalist, that of cynical nihilism. Where Fox News and Western governments condemn the Islamic fundamentalist for an excess of belief, for that is what is assumed is going on when one becomes a suicide bomber, we are not permitted to discuss the generations of US imperialist destruction in the Middle East. We are tacitly held to the more sophisticated creed of nihilism. We are free to be a tourist in other cultures and subcultures, but it all takes place in the marketplace of ideas, the circus of values known as late-stage capitalism. Essentially, from our Western first world vantage point of no fixed position, our flaky diets, hippie cults, Burning Man festivals, viral videos, MTV, etc., etc., what was once a social relation, Western cultures, becomes an economic one. So people go to the mall to hang out, the nightclub to party, So nightclubs are basically giant warehouses where they pump you full of sugared, watered-down alcohol and charge you extortionate prices for it, in the hope that you might meet someone who loves you, as the Smiths said. Ask yourself, how many folk songs, or local history, or traditional games, or authentic local cuisines do you know of? We have traded in our history for a VCR. There's another quote, Rage Against the Machine. And VCR was how kids learned about the birds and bees in the 80s and 90s, probably from a Japanese cartoon that their mum thought was some sort of Asian Disney. My point being that just as an Islamic fundamentalist supposedly dare not question their beliefs, lest they become an infidel, the dominant ideology of Western fundamentalism is that we have to be flexible, gig economy workers. We don't believe in much at all, but we will take what we can get. The second we do reach out for something greater than ourselves, we have violated a core tenet of capital, the myth of rational actors pursuing their own self-interest. Now, this is the phrase we always hear on TV whenever anyone's like spruiking capitalism. In short, we have become a sucker, a loser. This core drive probably kept me from joining a Marxist party sooner than I did. To believe or commit to something is seen as a kind of faux pas. It is viewed as being very uncool and even immoral. This is the boss inside of us, making sure that we police ourselves with a cool, detached irony. I see anti-natalism as anti-human, because in it, I see this Western fundamentalism is turned against itself. It has become a kind of suicidal death instinct. This is not revolutionary, and it needs to be resisted. It's also anti-intellectual at its core. Action without theory is blind. Anti-natalism is a kind of melancholic reaction, rooted in white, middle-class despair at their failing fortunes underneath neoliberal austerity. Bearing no children as a political action is like recycling, an egomaniacal delusion that an individual can have any impact on the global industrial scale of waste that accumulates each and every day. All right, I'm getting up to my second point now. Point 2. Anti-natalism is a self-defeating bourgeois nihilism. Okay, so those of you that don't know what nihilism means, there's lots of philosophy, sort of tube and things like that on the internet and YouTube. But essentially nihilism boils down to a crisis of faith. That's probably the original meaning. Here what I mean is that it's just a belief in kind of nothing. You're upholding no ideal, and you have no stake in any ideological position. Okay, and bourgeois means it's sort of middle class. The reason that anti-natalism is a terrible idea on the level of political activism and tactics is one that we see when we study the evolution of memes. So I'm not talking about 4chan here. I'm talking about Richard Dawkins' concept that ideas have a kind of cultural evolutionary trajectory. So Dawkins' idea is that ideas can be subject to similar kinds of natural selection that affect their survival. For example, how far they spread and how much the ideas are adopted, and for how long and by how many people. So Richard Dawkins maintained that religions like Christianity persist for so long, not because they were particularly good ideas or even that they adequately describe the world around them, but that they contain the instructions, if you will, for their own reproduction. Christians must obey God and keep no false idols. They must convert the heathens and the wicked, etc. Basically, religion has lasted for millennia because most holy books told you to pass on the good word, ensuring its proliferation. Well, antinatalism is doing the opposite. By not having children as a political action, you are increasing the chances of there being fewer vegans in the next generation, and therefore more carnivores and omnivores take their place. Also, why not take the logic of the movement to its extreme and commit suicide. Now that might seem a bit extreme, but that's kind of the logic of this whole thing. Like, why, if you're not going to reproduce and you think that the world is a horrible place to exist in politically, then why not do that? So I doubt many anti-natalists or the people that espouse the ideology seriously consider this as a political statement. But it shows that their bourgeois individualism and a lack of consistent theory. I think that the antenatal movement is a bit of a joke, honestly, but it serves as a lesson to vegans and leftists of all stripes on the impotence of liberal ideology to wage effective or even a coherent struggle against the very real oppression that animals, people, and the environment suffer under the yoke of capitalism. Antinatalism doesn't understand the basic slogan of unionism, which is united we stand, divided we fall. That's a slogan for a reason. Individualism is exactly where the corporations and neoliberal governments want us, so we have no collective voice or bargaining power. If we want a planet to live on for the next generation, we need to collectively organise and reject this sort of short-sighted nihilism.